And when he finally understood what I wanted, he went away and came back a little later with my hat. Nothing was missing then except the lace to fasten my hat to my buttonhole, but that was something I could not hope to make him understand, and so I did not mention it. An old lace, you can always find an old lace. No lace lasts forever the way clothes do, real clothes. As for the bicycle, I had hopes that it was waiting for me somewhere below stairs, perhaps even before the front door, ready to carry me away from these horrible scenes, and I did not see what good it would do to ask for it again, to submit him and myself to this fresh ordeal when it could be avoided. These considerations crossed my mind with a certain rapidity now with regard to the pockets. For in all of my clothes I verified their contents in front of the valet and discovered that certain things were missing. My sucking stone in particular was no longer there. But sucking stones abound on our beaches when you know where to look for them, and I deemed it wiser to say nothing about it, all the more so as he would have been capable after an hour's argument of going and fetching me from the garden a completely unsuckable stone. This was a decision, too, which I took almost instantaneously, but of the other objects which had disappeared, why speak, since I did not know exactly what they were? And perhaps they had been taken from me at the police station without my knowing it, or scattered and lost when I fell, or at some other time, or thrown away, for I would sometimes throw away all I had about me in a burst of irritation, so why speak of them? I resolved, nevertheless, to declare loudly that a knife was missing, a noble knife, and I did so to such effect that I soon received a very fine vegetable knife, so-called stainless. But it didn't take me long to stain it, and which opened and shut into the bargain unlike all the vegetable knives I had ever known, and which had a safety catch, highly dangerous, as soon appeared, and the cause of innumerable cuts all over my fingers, caught between the handle of so-called genuine Irish horn and the blade red with rust and so blunted that it was less a matter of cuts than of contusions. And if I deal at such length with this knife, it is because I have it somewhere still, I think, among my possessions, and because having dealt with it here at such length, I shall not have to deal with it again when the moment comes, if it ever comes, to draw up the list of my possessions, and that will be a relief, a welcome relief, when that moment comes, I know. For it is natural I should dilate at lesser length on what I lost than on what I could not lose, that goes without saying. And if I do not always appear to observe this principle, it is because it escapes me from time to time and vanishes as utterly as if I had never adduced it. Mad words, no matter, for I no longer know what I am doing, nor why. Those are things I understand less and less. I don't deny it. For why deny it? And to whom? To you? To whom nothing is denied? And then doing fills me with such a, impossible to express for me now after so long, yes, that I don't stop to inquire in virtue of what principle. And all the less so as whatever I do, that is to say, whatever I say, it will always, as it were, be the same thing, yes, as it were. And if I speak of principles when there are none, I can't help it. There must be some somewhere. And if always doing the same thing, as it were, is not the same as observing the same principle, I can't help it either. And then how can you know whether you are observing it or not? And how can you want to know? No, all that is not worthwhile bothering about, and yet you do bother about it. Your sense of value is gone, and the things that are worthwhile you do not bother about. You let them be for the same reason, or wisely, knowing that all these questions of worth and value have nothing to do with you who don't know what you're doing, nor why, and must go on not knowing it on pain of, I wonder what, yes, I wonder. For anything worse than what I do without knowing what or why I have never been able to conceive, and that doesn't surprise me, for I never tried. For had I been able to conceive something worse than what I had, I would have known no peace until I got it, if I know anything about myself. And what I have, what I am, is enough, was always enough for me. And as far as my dear little, sweet little future is concerned, I have no qualms. I have a good time coming. So I put on my clothes, having first made sure they had not been tampered with. That is to say, I put on my trousers, my greatcoat, my hat, and my boots. My boots. They came up to where my calves would have been if I had calves, and partly they buttoned, or would have buttoned, if they had had buttons. And partly they laced. And I have them still, I think, somewhere. Then I took my crutches and left the room. The whole day had gone in this tomfoolery, and it was dusk again. Going down the stairs, I inspected the window I had seen through the door. It lit the staircase with its wild tawny light. Luce was in the garden, fussing around the grave. She was sowing grass on it, as if grass wouldn't have sown itself on it. She was taking advantage of the cool of evening. Seeing me, she came warmly towards me and gave me food and drink. I ate and drank standing, casting about me in search of my bicycle. She talked and talked. Soon sated, I began the search for my bicycle. She followed me. In the end, I found it half buried in a soft bush. I threw aside my crutches and took it in my hands by the saddle and the handlebars, intending to wheel it a little back and forth before getting on and leaving forever this accursed place. But I pushed and pulled in vain. The wheels would not turn. It was as though the brakes were jammed, and heaven knows they were not, for my bicycle had no brakes. And suddenly overcome by a great weariness, in spite of the dying day when I always felt most alive, I threw the bicycle back in the bush and lay down on the ground on the grass, careless of the dew. I never feared the dew. It was then that Luce, taking advantage of my weakness, squatted down beside me and began to make me propositions, to which I must confess I listened absent-mindedly. I had nothing else to do. I could do nothing else, and doubtless she had poisoned my beer with something intended to mollify me, to mollify Molloy, with the result that I was nothing more than a lump of melting wax, so to speak. And from these propositions, which she enunciated slowly and distinctly, repeating each clause several times, I finally elicited the following, or gist. I could not prevent her having a weakness for me, neither could she. I would live in her home as though it were my own. I would have plenty to eat and drink, to smoke too if I smoked, for nothing in my remaining days would glide away without a care. I would, as it were, take the place of the dog I had killed, as it for her had taken the place of a child. I would help in the garden and the house when I wished, if I wished. I would not go out on the street, for once out I would never find my way in again. I would adopt the rhythm of life which best suited me, getting up, going to bed, and taking my meals at whatsoever hours I pleased. If I did not choose to be clean, to wear nice clothes, to wash, and so on, I need not. She would be grieved, but what was her grief compared to my grief? All she asked was to feel me near her, with her, and the right to contemplate from time to time this extraordinary body both at rest and in motion. Every now and then I interrupted her to ask what town I was in, but either because she did not understand me or because she preferred to leave me in ignorance, she did not reply to my question, but went on with her soliloquy, reiterating tirelessly each new proposition, then expounding further, slowly, gently, the benefits for both of us if I would make my home with her, till nothing was left but this monotonous voice and the deepening night and the smell of the damp earth and of strongly scented flower, which at the time I could not identify, but which later I identified as spike lavender. There were beds of it everywhere in this garden, for Luce loved spike. She must have told me herself, otherwise I would not have known. She loved it above all other herbs and flowers because of its smell, and then also because of its spikes and its color. And if I had not lost my sense of smell, and smell of lavender would always make me think of Luce. In accordance with the well-known mechanism of association, she gathered this lavender when it bloomed, I presume, left it to dry, and then made it up into lavender bags that she put in her cupboards to perfume her handkerchiefs, her underclothing, and house linen. But nonetheless, from time to time, I heard the chiming of the hours from the clocks and belfries, chiming out longer and longer, then suddenly, briefly, then longer and longer again. This will give some idea of the time she took to cozen me, of her patience and physical endurance for all the time she was squatting or kneeling beside me, whereas I was stretched out at my ease on the grass, now on my back, now on my stomach, now on one side, now on the other. And all the time she never stopped talking, whereas I only opened my mouth to ask at long intervals, more and more feebly, what town we were in. And sure of her victory at last, or simply feeling she had done all she could and that further insistence was useless, she got up and went away, I don't know where, for I stayed where I was with regret, mild regret. For in me there have always been two fools, among others, one asking nothing better than to stay where he is, and the other imagining that life might be slightly less horrible a little further on. So that I was never disappointed, so to speak, whatever I did in this domain. And these inseparable fools I indulged turn about that they might understand their foolishness. And that night there was no question of moon nor any other light, but it was a night of listening, a night given to the faint soughing and sighing stirring. At night in little pleasure gardens, the shy Sabbath of leaves and petals and the air that eddies there as it does not in other places where there is less constraint, and as it does not during the day when there is more vigilance. And then something else that is not clear, being neither the air nor what it moves, perhaps the far unchanging noise the earth makes, in which other noises cover, but not for long. And that night there was no question of moon nor any other light, but it was a night of listening, a night given to the faint soughing and sighing stirring at night in little pleasure gardens, the shy Sabbath of leaves and petals in the air that eddies there as it does not in other places where there is less constraint, and as it does not during the day when there is more vigilance, and then something else that is not clear, being neither the air nor what it moves, perhaps the far unchanging noise the earth makes, in which other noises cover, but not for long. For they do not account for that noise you hear when you really listen, when all seems hushed. And there was another noise, that of my life become the life of this garden as it rode the earth of deeps and wildernesses. Yes, there were times when I forgot not only who I was, but that I was, forgot to be. Then I was no longer that sealed jar to which I owed my being so well preserved. But a wall gave way and I filled with roots and tame stems, for example. Stakes long since dead and ready for burning. The recess of night and the eminence of dawn, and then the labor of the planet, rolling eager into winter. Winter would rid it of these contemptible scabs. Or of that winter I was the precarious calm, the thaw of the snows which make no difference, and all the horrors of it all over again. But that did not happen to me often. Mostly I stayed in my jar, which knew neither seasons nor gardens. And a good thing too, but in there you have to be careful. Ask yourself questions, as for example, whether you still are, and if no, when it stopped. And if yes, how long it will still go on, anything at all to keep you from losing the thread of the dream. For my part, I willingly asked myself questions, one after the other, just for the sake of looking at them. No, not willingly, wisely, so that I might believe I was still there, and yet it meant nothing to me to still be there. Perhaps that was the cause of my innocence. It was a little the worse for wear, a little threadbare perhaps, but I was glad to have it, yes, I suppose. Thanks, I suppose, as the urchin said when I picked up his marble. I don't know why, I didn't have to. And I suppose he would have preferred to pick it up himself, or perhaps it wasn't to be picked up, and the effort it cost me with my stiff leg. The words engraved themselves forever on my memory, perhaps because I understood them at once, a thing I didn't often do The words engraved themselves forever on my memory, perhaps because I understood them at once, a thing I didn't often do. Not that I was hard of hearing, for I had quite a sensitive ear, and sounds unencumbered with precise meaning were registered perhaps better by me than most. What was it then? The defect of the understanding, perhaps, which only began to vibrate on repeated solicitations, or which did not vibrate, A defect of the understanding, perhaps, which only began to vibrate on repeated solicitations, or which did vibrate, if you like, but at a lower frequency, or a higher than that of ratiocination, if such a thing is conceivable. And such a thing is conceivable, since I conceive it. Yes, the words I heard, and heard distinctly, having quite a sensitive ear, were heard a first time, then a second, often even a third, as pure sounds, free of all meaning, and this is probably one of the reasons why conversation was unspeakably painful to me. And the words I uttered myself, and which must nearly always have gone with an effort of the intelligence, were often to me as the buzzing of an insect, and this is perhaps one of the reasons I was so untalkative. I mean, this trouble I had in understanding not only what others said to me, but also what I said to them. It is true that in the end, by dint of patience, we made ourselves understood, but understood with regard to what, I ask of you, and to what purpose? And to the noises of nature, too, and of the works of men, I reacted, I think, in my own way and without desire of enlightenment. And my eye, too, the seeing one, must have been ill connected with the spider, for I found it hard to name what was mirrored there, often quite distinctly. And without goings so far as to say that I saw the world upside down, that would have been too easy. It is certain I saw it in a way inordinately formal, though I was far from being an aesthete or an artist. And of my two eyes, only one functioning more or less correctly, I misjudged the distance separating me from the other world, and often I stretched out my hand for what was far beyond my reach. And often I knocked against obstacles scarcely visible on the horizon. But I was like that even when I had my two eyes, it seems to me, but perhaps not, for it is long since that era of my life, and my recollection of it is more than imperfect. And now I come to think of it, my attempts at taste and smell were scarcely more fortunate. I smelt and tasted without knowing exactly what, nor whether it was good, nor whether it was bad, and seldom twice running the same thing. I would have been, I think, an excellent husband, incapable of wearying of my wife and committing adultery only from absent-mindedness. Now, as to telling you why I stayed a good while with Luce, no, I cannot. That is to say, I could, I suppose, if I took the trouble, but why should I? In order to establish beyond all question that I could not do otherwise, for that is the conclusion I would come to. Fatally, I who would love the image of old Glinks, dead young, who left me free on the black boat of Ulysses to crawl towards the east along the deck. That is a great measure of freedom for him who has not the pioneering spirit, and from the poop, pouring upon the wave, a sadly rejoicing slave, I follow with my eyes the proud and futile wake. Which, as it bears me from no fatherland away, bears me onward to no shipwreck. A good while then with Luce, it's vague, a good while, a few months perhaps, a year perhaps. I know it was warm again the day I left, but that meant nothing in my part of the world where it seemed to be warm or cold, or merely mild at any moment of the year, and where the days did not run gently up and down. No, not gently. Perhaps things have changed since. So all I know is that it was much the same weather when I left as when I came, so far as I was capable of knowing what the weather was. And I had been under the weather so long, under all weathers, that I could tell quite well between them. My body could tell between them and seemed even to have its likes, its dislikes. I think I stayed in several rooms, one after the other, or alternately, I don't know. In my head there are several windows that I do know, but perhaps it is always the same one, open variously on the parading universe. The house was fixed. That is perhaps what I mean by these different rooms. House and garden were fixed, thanks to some unknown mechanism of compensation. And I, when I stayed still, as I did most of the time, was fixed too. And when I moved from place to place, it was very slowly, as in a cage out of time, as the saying is, in the jargon of the schools, and out of space too, to be sure. For to be out of one and not out of the other was for cleverer than me, who was not clever, but foolish. But I may be quite wrong. And these different windows that open in my head when I grope again among those days really existed perhaps, and perhaps do still, in spite of my being no longer there. I mean, there looking at them, opening them and shutting them, or crouched in a corner of the room, marveling at the things they framed. But I will not dwell on this episode, so ludicrously brief when you think of it, and so poor in substance. For I helped neither in the house nor the garden, and knew nothing of what work was going forward day and night, nothing save the sounds that came to me. Dull sounds and sharp ones too. And then often the roar of air being vigorously churned, it seemed to me, in which perhaps was nothing more than the sound of burning. I preferred the garden to the house, to judge by the long hours I spent there, for I spent there the greater part of the day and of the night, whether it was wet or whether it was fine. Men were always busy there, working at I know not what, for the garden seemed hardly to change from day to day, apart from the tiny changes due to the customary cycle of birth, life, and death. And in the midst of those men, I drifted like a dead leaf on springs. Or else I lay down on the ground, and then they stepped gingerly over me as though I had been a bed of rare flowers. Yes, it was doubtless in order to preserve the garden from apparent change that they labored at it thus. My bicycle had disappeared again. Sometimes I felt the wish to look for it again, to find it again, and find out what was wrong with it, or even go for a little ride on the walks and paths connecting the different parts of the garden. But instead of trying to satisfy this wish, I stayed where I was looking at it, if I may say so. Looking at it as it shriveled up and finally disappeared like the famous fatal skin, only much quicker. For there seemed to be two ways of behaving in the presence of wishes, the active and the contemplative, and though they both give the same result, it was the latter I preferred. Matter of temperament, I presume. The garden was surrounded with a high wall, its top bristling with broken glass like fins. But what must have been absolutely unexpected was that this wall was broken by a wicket gate giving free access to the road, for it was never locked. Of that I was all but convinced, having opened and closed it without the least trouble on more than one occasion, both by day and by night, and seen it used by others than myself for the purpose as well of entrance as of exit. I would stick out my nose and hastily call it in again. A few further remarks. Never did I see a woman within these precincts, and by precincts I do not merely mean the garden as I probably should, but the house too, but only men, with the obvious exception of Luce. What I saw and did not see did not matter much admittedly, but I mention it all the same. Luce herself I saw but little. She seldom showed herself to me, out of tact perhaps, fearing to alarm me. But I think she spied on me a great deal, hiding behind the bushes or the curtains, or skulking in the shadows of a first-floor room with a spyglass perhaps, for had she not said she desired above all to see me, both coming and going, and rooted to the spot? And to get a good view you need the keyhole, the little chink among the leaves, and so on. Whatever prevents you from being seen and from seeing more than a little at a time. No? I don't know. Yes, she inspected me. Little by little, and even in my very going to bed, my sleeping and my getting up the mornings that I went to bed. For in this matter I remained faithful to my custom, which was to sleep in the morning when I slept at all. For it sometimes happened that I did not sleep at all for several days without feeling at all the worse for it, for my waking was a kind of sleeping, and I did not always sleep in the same place, but now I slept in the garden, which was large, and now I slept in the house, which was large too. Really extremely spacious, and this uncertainty as to the hour and place of my sleeping must have entranced her, I imagine, and made the time pass pleasantly. But it is useless to dwell on this period of my life. If I go on long enough calling that my life, I'll end up by believing it. It's the principle of advertising. This period of my life. It reminds me, when I think of it, of air in a water pipe. So I will only add that this woman went on giving me slow poisons, slipping I know not what poisons into the drink she gave me, or into the food she gave me, or both, or one day one, the next the other. That is a grave charge to bring, and I do not bring it lightly, and I bring it without ill feeling. Yes, I accuse her without ill feeling of having drugged my food and drink with noxious and insipid powders and potions. But even sipid, they would have made no difference. I would have swallowed it all down with the same wholeheartedness. That celebrated whiff of almonds, for example, would never have taken away my appetite. My appetite! What a subject for conversation. I had hardly any. I ate like a thrush. But the little I did eat, I devoured with a voracity usually attributed to heavy eaters, and wrongly, for heavy eaters, as a rule, eat ponderously and with method. That follows from the very notion of heavy eating. Whereas I flung myself at the mess, gulped down the half or the quarter of it in two mouthfuls without chewing. With what would I have chewed? Then pushed it from me with loathing. One would have thought I ate to live. Similarly, I would engulf 5 or 6 mugs of beer with one swig. Then drink nothing for a week. What do you expect? One is what one is, partly at least. Nothing or little to be done. Now, as to the substances she insinuated thus into my various systems, I could not say whether they were stimulants or whether they were not rather depressants. The truth is, Cohen aesthetically speaking, of course, I felt more or less the same as usual, that is to say, if I may give myself away, so terror-stricken that I was virtually bereft of feeling, not to say of consciousness, and drowned in a deep and merciful torpor, shot with brief abominable gleams, I give you my word. Against such harmony of what avail the miserable mollies of Luce, administered in infinitesimal doses probably, to draw the pleasure out. Not that they remained entirely without effect. No, that would be an exaggeration, for from time to time I caught myself making a little bound in the air, 2 or 3 feet off the ground at least, I who never bounded. It looked like levitation, and it happened too, less surprisingly, when I was walking, or even propped up against something, that I suddenly collapsed like a puppet when its strings are dropped, and lay long where I fell, literally boneless. Yes, that struck me as less strange, for I was used to collapsing thus, but with this difference, that I felt it coming, and prepared myself accordingly, as an epileptic does when he feels the fit coming. I mean that knowing I was going to fall, I lay down, or I wedged myself where I stood so firmly that nothing short of an earthquake could have dislodged me, and I waited. But these were precautions I did not always take, preferring the fall to the trouble of having to lie down or stand fast. Whereas the falls I suffered when with loose did not give me a chance to circumvent them. But all the same, they surprised me less. They were more in keeping with me than the little bounds. For even as a child, I do not remember ever having bounded. Neither rage nor pain ever made me bound. Even as a child, however ill-qualified I am to speak of that time. Now, with regard to my food, it seems to me I ate it as, when, and where it best suited me. I never had to call for it. It was brought to me wherever I happened to be on a tray. I can still see the tray almost at will. It was round with a low rim to keep the things from falling off and coated with red lacquer, cracking here and there. It was small, too, as became a tray having to hold a single dish and one slab of bread. For the little I ate, I crammed into my mouth with my hands, and the bottles I drank from the bottle were brought to me separately in a basket. But this basket made no impression on me, good or bad, and I could not tell you what it was like, and many a time, having strayed for one reason or another from the place where the meal had been brought to me, I couldn't find it again when I felt the desire to eat. Then I searched high and low, often with success, being fairly familiar with the places where I was likely to have been, but often too in vain. Or I did not search at all, preferring hunger and thirst to the trouble of having to search without being sure of finding, or of having to ask for another tray to be brought in another basket or the same to the place where I was. It was then I regretted my sucking stone, and when I talk of preferring, for example, or regretting, it must not be supposed that I opted for the least evil and adopted it, for that would be wrong. For not knowing exactly what I was doing or avoiding, I did it and avoided it all, unsuspecting that one day much later I would have to go back over all these acts and omissions dimmed and mellowed by age and drag them into the eudaimonistic slop. But I must say that with loose my health got no worse, or scarcely. By which I mean that what was already wrong with me got worse and worse, little by little, as was only to be expected. But there was kindled no new seed of suffering or infection, except, of course, those arising from the spread of existing plethoras and deficiencies. But I may very well be wrong, for of the disorders to come, as for example the loss of the toes of my left foot. No, I am wrong, my right foot. Who can say exactly when on my helpless clay the fatal seeds were sown? So all I can say, and I do my best to say no more, is that during my stay with loose, no more new symptoms appeared of a pathological nature. I mean, nothing new or strange, nothing I could not have foreseen if I could have. Nothing at all comparable to the sudden loss of half my toes, for that is something I could never have foreseen, and the meaning of which I have never fathomed. I mean, its connection with my other discomforts, from my ignorance of medical matters, I suppose. For all things run together in the body's long madness, I feel it. But it is useless to drag out this chapter of my, my existence, for it has no sense to my mind. It is a dug at which I tug in vain. It yields nothing but wind and spatter. So I will confine myself to the following brief additional remarks, and the first of which is this: that Luce was a woman of an extraordinary flatness, physically speaking, of course, to such a point that I'm still wondering this evening in the comparative silence of my last abode if she was not a man rather, or at least an androgyne. She had a somewhat hairy face, or am I imagining it, in the interests of the narrative? The poor woman, I saw her so little, looked at her, and was not her voice suspiciously deep, so she appears to me today. Don't be tormenting yourself, Molloy, man or woman, what does it matter? But I cannot help asking myself the following question. Could a woman have stopped me as I swept towards mother? Probably. Better still, was such an encounter possible, I mean between me and a woman? Now, men, I've rubbed up against a few men in my time, but women? Oh, well, I may as well confess it now. Yes, I once rubbed up against one. I don't mean my mother. I did more than rub up against her. And if you don't mind, we'll leave my mother out of all this, but another who might have been my mother, and even I think my grandmother, if chance had not willed otherwise. Listen to him now talking about chance. It was she made me acquainted with love. She went by the peaceful name of Ruth, I think. But I can't say for certain. Perhaps the name was Edith. She had a hole between her legs. Oh, not the bunghole I had always imagined, but a slit. And in this I put, or rather she put, my so-called virile member. Not without difficulty. And I toiled and moiled until I discharged or gave up trying or was begged by her to stop. Fucking fly. Bastard. A mug's game, in my opinion, and tiring on top of that in the long run. But I lent myself to it with a good enough grace, knowing it was love, for she had told me so. She bent over the couch because of her rheumatism, and in I went from behind. It was the only position she could bear because of her lumbago. It seemed all right to me, for I had seen dogs, and I was astonished when she confided that you could go about it differently. I wonder what she meant exactly. Perhaps, after all, she put me in her rectum. A matter of complete indifference to me, I needn't tell you. But is it true love in the rectum? That's what bothers me sometimes. Have I never known true love after all? She too was an eminently flat woman, and she moved with short, stiff steps, leaning on an ebony stick. Perhaps she too was a man, yet another of them. But in that case, surely our testicles would have collided while we writhed. Perhaps she held hers tight in her hand on purpose to avoid it. She favored voluminous, tempestuous shifts and petticoats and other undergarments whose names I forget. They welled up all frothing and swishing, and then Congress achieved broke over us in slow cascades. And all I could see was her taut yellow nape, which every now and then I set my teeth in, forgetting I had none, such is the power of instinct. We met in a rubbish dump, unlike any other, and yet they are all alike, rubbish dumps. I don't know what she was doing there. I was limply poking about in the garbage, saying probably, for at that age I must still have been capable of general ideas, this is life. She had no time to lose. I had nothing to lose. I would have made love with a goat to know what love was. She had a dainty flat. No, not dainty. Made you want to lie down in a corner and never get up again. I liked it. It was full of dainty furniture. Under our desperate strokes, the couch moved forward on its casters. The whole place fell about our ears. It was pandemonium. Our commerce was not without tenderness. With trembling hands, she cut my toenails and I rubbed her rump with winter cream. This idyll was one of short duration. Poor Edith, I hastened her end, perhaps. Anyway, it was she who started it in the rubbish dump when she laid her hand upon my fly. More precisely, I was bent double over a heap of muck in the hope of finding something to disgust me forever with eating when she, undertaking me from behind, thrust her stick between my legs and began to titillate my privates. She gave me money after each session to me who would have consented to know love and probe it to the bottom without charge, but she was an idealist. I would have preferred, it seems to me, an orifice less arid and roomy that would have given me a higher opinion of love, it seems to me. However, twixt finger and thumb 'tis heaven in comparison. But love is no doubt above such base contingencies. And not when you're comfortable, but when your frantic member casts about for a rubbing place, and the unction of a little mucous membrane in meeting with none does not beat and retreat, but retains its tumefaction. It is then no doubt that true love comes to pass and wings away high above the tight fit and the loose. And when you add a little pedicure and massage having nothing to do with the instant of bliss, strictly speaking, then I feel no further doubt is justified in this connection. The other thing that bothers me in this connection is the indifference with which I learned of her death. One black night I was crawling towards her, an indifference softened indeed by the pain of losing a source of revenue. She died taking a warm tub, as her custom was before receiving me. It limbered her up. When I think she might have expired in my arms, the tub overturned and the dirty water spilt all over the floor and down on top of the lodger below, who gave the alarm. Well, I didn't think I knew this story so well. She must have been a woman after all. If she hadn't been, it would have got around in the neighborhood. It is true they were extraordinarily reserved in my part of the world about everything connected with sexual matters. But things have perhaps changed since my time, and it is quite possible that the fact of having found a man when they should have found a woman was immediately repressed and forgotten by the few unfortunate enough to know about it, as it is quite possible that everybody knew about it and spoke about it with the sole exception of myself. But there's one thing that torments me when I delve into all this, and that is to know whether all my life has been devoid of love or whether I really met with it in Ruth. What I do know for certain is that I never sought to repeat the experience, having, I suppose, the intuition that it had been unique and perfect of its kind, achieved and inimitable, and that it behoved me to preserve its memory, pure of all pastiche, in my heart, even if it meant my resorting from time to time to the alleged joys of so-called self-abuse. Don't talk to me about the chambermaid. I should never have mentioned her. She was long before. I was sick. Perhaps there was no chambermaid ever in my life. Molloy, or Life Without a Chambermaid. All of which goes to demonstrate that the fact of having met Luce and even frequented her in a way proved nothing as to her sex. And I'm quite willing to go on thinking of her as an old woman, widowed and withered, and of Ruth as another, for she too used to speak of her defunct husband and of his inability to satisfy her legitimate cravings, and there are days like this evening when my memory confuses them and I am tempted to think of them as one and the same old hag, flattened and crazed by life. And God forgive me, to tell you the horrible truth, my mother's image sometimes mingles with theirs, which is literally unendurable, like being crucified. I don't know why, and I don't want to. But I left Luz at last one warm, airless night without saying goodbye, as I might at least have done, and without her trying to hold me back, except perhaps by spells. But she must have seen me go, get up, take my crutches and go away, springing on them through the air. And she must have seen the wicket close behind me, for it closed for itself, with the help of a spring, and known me gone forever. For she knew the way I had of going to the wicket and peeping out, then quickly drawing back, and she did not try and hold me back, but she went and sat down on her dog's grave, perhaps, which was mine too in a way, in which, by the way, she had not sown with grass, as I had thought, but with all kinds of little many-colored flowers and herbaceous plants, selected, I imagine, in such a way that when someone went out, others lit up. I left her my bicycle, which I had taken a dislike to. I left her my bicycle, which I had taken a dislike to, suspecting it to be the vehicle of some malignant agency and perhaps the cause of my recent misfortunes. But all the same, I would have taken it with me if I had known where it was and that it was in running order, but I did not. And I was afraid if I tried to find out of wearing out the small voice saying, "Get out of here, Molloy, take your crutches and get out of here," in which I had taken so long to understand, for I had been hearing it for a long time. And perhaps I understood it all wrong, but I understood it, and that was the novelty. And it seemed to me I was not necessarily going for good, and that I might come back one day by devious, winding ways to the place I was leaving. And perhaps my course is not yet fully run. Outside in the road, the wind was blowing. It was another world, not knowing where I was, nor consequently what way I ought to go. I went with the wind, and when well slung between my crutches, I took off. Then I felt it helping me, that little wind blowing from what quarter I could not tell. And don't come talking at me of the stars. They look all the same to me. Yes, I cannot read the stars in spite of my astronomical studies, but I entered the first shelter I came to and stayed there till dawn, for I knew I was bound to be stopped by the first policeman and asked what I was doing, a question to which I have never been able to find the correct reply. But it cannot have been a real shelter, and I did not stay till dawn, for a man came in soon after me and drove me out. Yet there was room for two. I think he was a kind of night watchman, a man of some kind, certainly. He must have been employed to watch over some kind of public works. Digging, I suppose. I see a brazier. There must have been a touch of autumn in the air, as the saying is. I therefore moved on and ensconced myself on a flight of stairs in a mean lodging house. Because there was no door, it didn't shut, I don't know. Long before dawn, this lodging house began to empty. People came down the stairs, men and women. I glued myself against the wall. They paid no heed to me. Nobody interfered with me. In the inn, I too went away when I deemed it prudent and wandered about the town in search of a familiar monument, so that I might say, I am in my town after all. I have been there all the time. The town was waking, doors opening and shutting. Soon the noise would be deafening, but espying a narrow alley between two high buildings, I looked about me, then slipped into it. Little windows overlooked it on either side, on every floor, facing one another. Lavatory lights, I suppose. There are things from time to time, in spite of everything, that impose themselves on the understanding with the force of axioms for unknown reasons. There was no way out of the alley. It was not so much an alley as a blind alley. At the end, there were two recesses. No, that's not the word. Opposite each other, littered with miscellaneous rubbish and with excrements of dogs and masters, some dry and odorless, others still moist. Ah, those papers never to be read again, perhaps never read. Here lovers must have lain at night and exchanged their vows. I entered one of the alcoves, wrong again, and leaned against the wall. I would have preferred to lie down, and there was no proof that I would not.